Hello students. In today's class we're going to look at architecture in chapter 11. In chapter 10 we looked at site-specific art, and you might say architecture is a kind of site-specific art, although this is also an art in which we live. Most of the time we live and work in buildings, and in a lot of ways this is the type of art that we have the most interaction with as human beings. And so we have a quote here from the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright, and we're also going to be looking at one of his famous works of architecture. And the quote is, "The mother art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization." So he's basically saying every culture has some form of architecture, and everything else has to kind of come out of that. So we're going to be asking these questions in this chapter. What is architecture? Why is architecture important to us? Why does architecture of all the arts have the greatest impact on our lives? Why does architecture determine the quality of the environments in which we work, play, live, meditate, and rest? So what you're looking at here is a very early humans dwelling. Basically, it's a reconstruction. None of these actually are still erected, at least I don't think so. But these are basically cocoons that humans built. Originally, people would have sought shelter in caves, which is provided naturally by nature, but people would also take the skeletal pieces of woolly mammoths, which of course were huge, and they would drag them to a protective spot and then arrange them into dome-like structures, as you see here. And Native Americans carved complex communities into the sides of mesa cliffs, which we will talk about as well. So architecture, our textbook definition. Architecture is the art and science of designing buildings, bridges, and other structures to meet our personal and communal needs. It is also a vehicle for artistic expression in 3 dimensions. And also what's interesting about the architect versus, say, a sculptor or a painter is that the architect has to be able to mediate between the client who is commissioning the building and what the needs of the client are, and also what the needs of the site are all around it, and work with a variety of different people as a negotiator. For example, he would also need to talk to the plumbing people, he would need to talk to the electrical people, he would have to talk to city and township type people to make sure that all the proper notifications and all the legal stuff is taken care of before he goes in and does the actual work. So we're going to look at some architectural materials. We're going to look at stone, wood, cast iron, steel cage, reinforced concrete, steel cable, and shell architecture. And we're going to talk about a couple of terms. A facade, which is essentially when a building might have a facade. A building, for example, might be made of wood but faced with brick or faced with siding. That would be the facade. Service systems are, of course, the things like plumbing, electricity, hot water, heat, the whole nine. So first off, we're going to look at stone architecture, which is probably the oldest. After all, people lived in stone caves. So stone is massive. It's virtually indestructible. Can also be, as we see with the Egyptian pyramids, a symbol of strength and permanence. It also expresses warmth. And a couple of terms, we're going to go back and look again at the Native American cliff dwellers, and inside those cliffs underground they would build kivas, which were circular underground community centers where large numbers of people could gather. And then adobe is dried mud, which is used in architectural construction. And what you'll see is although they were building directly into the cliff side, they used adobe construction to create the actual dwellings. So here are the cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde in California. They're Native American. We also say pre-Columbian because they were there before Columbus came along. And what you see, they go far into the face of the cliff wall there, and all the buildings that you see are actually I just realized I'm not in slideshow mode. All of those buildings that you see there, here we go, that's better. Oh, look at that, are made of adobe mud brick, essentially. And then post and lintel, after that, is probably the oldest of all construction types that we have. What you're looking at here is a photograph of Stonehenge, and we'll learn more about that in chapter 13. Stonehenge is one of those things that they still don't know all of the exact purposes of, except that it probably served religious or astronomical purposes. It is oriented towards the sun and laid out in concentric circles, which is suggestive of ancient amphitheaters and temples that will follow after it. And it's an early example of post and lintel construction. You have two vertical posts with a horizontal lintel on top, and in between those you have an opening. So here's a nice illustration of that. And the arrows that we'll be seeing on all of these little illustrations in this chapter show you how the weight is borne. The weight is borne by, it's going down from the horizontal lintel. The posts are holding it up. And dry masonry essentially refers to any type of construction that doesn't need to use bricks and mortar. Might use bricks, but it might not use mortar, probably doesn't use cement. The stones are very carefully and intricately fitted together. So here at Machu Picchu in Peru, ancient structure goes back over 500 years, and yet it holds up still. So that is pretty amazing. And there's a few other dry masonry examples I could tell you about. For example, Great Zimbabwe in the country of Zimbabwe in Africa is also an example of dry masonry. Another example of dry masonry is the Temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak, also an example of post and lintel construction, where you have the vertical posts and the horizontal lintels going across, and also, again, there is no mortar being used in this. This is an example of dry masonry. And the Parthenon of Greece, which you see here, is also of post and lintel construction, and we'll see more about the Parthenon in chapter 14. But what you need to know for right now is you're probably wondering, well, why does it look so crappy? Why does it look so beaten up? Well, it's a building that's over 2,000 years old, for one thing, and Greece has also been through a couple of wars, not to mention World War II being part of that, as well as local things going on territorially. Also, we have the case of Lord Elgin, who's an English lord, and at one time they actually had sculptures that were all across the top of the Parthenon. Those are now in the British Museum because Lord Elgin thought that he could take better care of them. Unfortunately, when we get to art history, you will see that there's a lot of cases like that throughout the world. But in any case, what we're looking at here is how it's also an example of post and lintel construction, and they were really interested on the functional purpose of the columns, and so the surfaces of the marble shafts of the columns are actually free from any ornamentation. The Greeks were very concerned with showing the beauty and simplicity of the design, so that's part of the reason. The sculpture and so forth went along the frieze along the side and what would have been the triangular pediment on top. Oh, stone as a favored material, so there it is, the Parthenon. Arches. So, okay, an arch. We go to arches next because an arch is what happens if you take your traditional post and lintel and you curve the lintel, you get an arch. And what ancient people began to discover is that with arches you can span distances, and when you can span distances you can make larger structures. So as it says in the second bullet point, they support other structures such as roofs. And they also serve as symbolic gateways, which we'll see in the Arch of Triumph in Paris, France. So architects of stone use arches to span distances, and arches have a number of functions, including, as I said, supporting other structures like roofs, and also serving as symbolic or actual gateways. So as you can see from our diagram, in most arches you have wedge-shaped blocks of stone, which are called voussoirs, and those are gradually placed in position, ascending a wooden scaffolding that would be on the other side of the arch, and that would be called a centering. And then once you plunk down the center stone, or the keystone as it's called, into place, the weight of the blocks is immediately transmitted in an arc laterally and downward, and then you remove the centering. So essentially this is also a form of dry masonry in that the pull of gravity on each block acts as cement. So the blocks fall into one another so that the very weight that made their whole erection a marvel now prevents them from budging at all. And the compressive strength of the stone allows the builder to build additional weight above the arch. And then in the case of a tunnel or a barrel vault, as you see in the center there, essentially what the builder would do is build a centering behind each arch each time he put up another layer until he got it to the length that he wanted it. And then when you take 4 arches and you join them together at the sides, that forms what's called a bay, and it sits on top of a square bay, and the joining between the arches is known as a groin vault, as you can see in the illustration there. So this is an example of an arch that doesn't really serve any architectural purpose other than to be a gateway, a literal gateway. It is the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. It was completed in 1966. Hopefully you saw that in the film you watched. And it stands 630 feet tall at the center and commemorates the westward push of the United States after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. And then you're looking at here, this is much older. This is during Roman times, was built the Pont du Gard near Nimes, France. And what this basically is, France, what am I saying? This is actually a bridge that is part of an aqueduct system. And this is part of something amazing that the early Romans did. It was the function of an aqueduct was to take water from one place to another. So they basically used these masonry arches in layers, as you can see, 3 rows. The top row is the smallest. The idea was having the largest arches on the bottom and the smallest on the top. It was supposed to be an aesthetic thing. It makes your eye go upward. And all of these were assembled without the benefit of mortar, which is pretty amazing. And the bridge still stands and functions today, 2,000 years after it was created. So as I mentioned earlier, an extended arch is called a vault, and a tunnel or barrel vault simply places arches behind one another until a desired depth is reached. And in this way you can make very impressive spaces that can be roofed, and then tunnels can be constructed. However, the spaces that you have there are dark because you can't pierce them with windows, because that would compromise their strength. So the communication of stresses from one arc to another also requires that the centering for each arch is kept in place until the whole thing is finished. So ancient church, well, not ancient, about 1,000-year-old churches used a lot of arches and vaults in their construction. And you're looking at a couple of medieval era churches that were using them. As you can see there, they seem very heavy in their construction. And what begins to happen is in the Middle Ages, they wanted to make their churches higher and higher and higher. And so they had to figure out how to do that, the engineering to do that, so that they could create buildings that didn't have quite this heavy feel to them. The Romans are actually credited with the creation of the groin vault, and that overcame the limitations of the barrel vault about as early as the 3rd century CE or AD, depending on your point of view. And groin vaults are constructed by placing barrel vaults at right angles to cover a square space. So in that way, the load of the intersecting vaults is transmitted to the corners, where you might want to put up a buttress, which I will show you what that is in a moment, but it allows the sides of the square to be open. So if we go back here for a moment, actually this slide doesn't really show that to you very well, so let's just keep going for the moment. So the square space, as I mentioned, enclosed by a groin vault is called a bay, and architects could now construct huge buildings by assembling any number of bays, because the stresses from one groin vault are not transmitted to a large degree to its neighbors. The centering for one vault can be removed and reused while the building is under construction. And the greatest loads in the groin vault are thrust into the 4 arches that compose the sides, and the 2 arches that run diagonally carry them. If the capacity of these diagonals is increased to carry a load by means of ribs, which you can see here in red, added to the vault, then the remainder of the roof can be fashioned from stone webbing or other materials that are lighter in weight. A true stone skeleton is created, and if you go into some of these medieval churches, you can literally see the skeleton of the building. And then the next thing that they discovered is if they used pointed arches, they could build the building even taller. So round arches can only enclose square bays. One could not use rounded arches in rectangular bays because the longer walls would have higher arches. So architects over the centuries served this problem by several ingenious ways, and the most important of these is from our Gothic architecture, which uses ribbed vaults and pointed arches. And pointed arches could be constructed to uniform heights even when the sides of the enclosed spaces are uneven. And then Gothic architecture, I mentioned the buttress. So what a buttress is something that comes out from the side of the building. It's a masonry strut that transmits part of the load of a vault to a buttress placed outside the building, and that's what you're looking at here. So we've seen some of this terminology already, bricks. Hopefully you knew what a brick was before this presentation. We saw the voussoir, which is the wedge-shaped block of the stone, of the key. It's also known as the keystone. The centering that is used to build the arches, the keystone again. Compressive strength and tiers. So I'm going to actually move along here. So stone, during the Gothic period, became a fully elegant skeletal structure in the great Gothic cathedrals, such as Notre Dame. And if you look at this building here, I'm going to use my little arrow to point at these things. These are the flying buttresses. So you can see in between each of these arches here, you've got a flying buttress, and that is allowing more weight to be borne on the building. And what also happens over time is the popularity of stained glass, which was not quite as huge in the 12th century when this was first built, but over time it became extremely popular, and with stained glass and these buttresses, you could have what appeared to be almost walls of glass in between the buttresses, because that would be what comprised the entire window. And what that then allowed for was this beautiful colored light streaming in from the outside when the sun would hit the window. So domes, we're going to talk about domes because everybody loves the dome. Every religion on earth loves the dome, whether it's Christianity or Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or Buddhism. All the religions seem to love domes because they represent the dome of the sky. In a lot of ways, the circle is also a symbol for eternity. So everybody seems to love it. So domes, in a lot of ways, express that circular principle. So domes are hemispherical forms When you view it from underneath, they appear to be rounded. Well, they are rounded. And they're also extensions of the principle of the arch. They're also capable of enclosing a vast amount of space. So a couple of terms that we're going to look at. Pendentives are the triangular surfaces used to support the dome on a square base. And when you see the diagram, you'll see what I'm talking about. And then the piers are the structures under the pendentives that the load of the dome is transferred to. And then because domes can be very, very heavy, you want them to have a thin veneer, a thin facade on the outside. So here is a diagram of a dome showing you how the weight is thrust outward on all sides. So even if you're building them of a lightweight material, you want to have something underneath that is going to hold all that stone, if in fact you're using stone. So this is a Buddhist temple. As I said, all religions seem to love the dome. And what's interesting about this building is you actually can't really go into it. These stupas, as they're called, are meant to represent the burial mound of the Buddha. And what the worshiper is supposed to do is walk around the outside of the temple and meditate. But in any case, this dome is a bit higher than maybe a regular Buddhist temple would be. It's 50 feet above the ground because they've got a dome, and it also allows the worshiper to contemplate the dwelling temple of the gods. Depending on the type of Buddhism, sometimes there's lots of gods involved, sometimes not. From place to place, Buddhism changes. But in any case, this dome was constructed from stones placed in gradually diminishing concentric circles, which are known as corbels. That'll be important later. Here we have the dome of the Pantheon in Rome, which was completed in the 1st century CE, and it is breathtaking, like it says in the slide, although I would spell that a bit differently. But like the dome of the stupa, the inner surface of the Pantheon symbolizes the heavens, and what it's known for is this circular opening at the top, which you can see in both images, and that is known as an oculus. And as you can see, in Roman times, before electricity, this would have been the only source of light. So what's interesting about that is the way the sun moves throughout the day, and that shaft of light moves throughout the Pantheon throughout the day. And then this is the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which I think I talked about way back in the 1st chapter. We're looking at it again here in the context of the of architecture. This dome is huge. It's 108 feet in diameter. And so here you have the dome. This is where we talk about pendentives. This is the dome. And then these triangular pieces here under this, these are the pendentives, and then down underneath of those are the piers, and that's where all of the weight from the dome is thrust into. But as you can see, the whole thing creates a very light, open, airy effect for people on the inside. So yeah, here we have again another illustration of a dome, and then the pendentive beneath it, and then this would be the area beneath the pier, sometimes also called a squinch. And also the geodesic dome is used a lot in building. I actually have friends who live in a geodesic dome house that they themselves built. And this is the Buckminster Fuller Dome, which was built for an expo, a worldwide World's Fair in '67 in Montreal. And basically he was trying to show kind of an indoor city that could be built within one of these giant domes. So other uses of stone in construction. Today we don't use it a lot because it can be very expensive to quarry and transport. So instead, what we often use are stone veneers, which would be very, very, very thin stone used as a facade. And then generally today, stone slabs are used for entry halls, for patios, and for gardens. So next we're going to look at wood architecture, and wood has advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are that it's attractive, it's versatile, it's abundant, it's renewable. We can grow forests and grow more wood. It's relatively lightweight. It can be worked on site with portable hand tools. Because of all the different kinds of trees, it comes in a variety of colors and grains. It weathers well. It can be painted. It can also be used on the facade or as a structural material. The disadvantages, if we're not careful, can be very big. It can warp, it can crack, it is highly flammable, and of course termites are a problem. So architects, like artists and designers, use contrasting materials to create visual diversity and surface interest. And they often reference textures found in nature in order to integrate a building with it on site or to create a dramatic counterpoint to the site. So this is actually tree houses. These are tree houses that were created by a German architectural studio called Baumraum. And if you watch HGTV, I think there's a couple of shows about designing tree houses. But this is a very fun, playful example of kind of both, of integrating a building with the site and also creating a counterpoint to the site. So the architects refer to these endeavors as a blend of architecture, landscape design, and arboriculture, aiming to integrate the structures into their forest surrounds and at the same time preserve the integrity of the host trees. So you can see how they're kind of using the trees as part of the design. One type of wooden construction is called post and beam, very similar to post and lintel. You have vertical and horizontal timbers cut and pieced together with wooden pegs, and the beams allow for windows, doors, and interior supports. They can also support another story or a roof. So here's an example of post and beam construction. And here is how they show they'd have an opening in the top of the post for a wooden peg to go into the beam on top of it. And then trusses carry that idea farther. Trusses are lengths of wood, iron, or steel pieced together in a triangular shape. Trusses can span large distance. They are also used as design and engineering elements. So here is an example of trusses, and if you've ever been inside an attic, you can kind of see this structure underlying the roof. And then balloon framing also carries that idea of the post and beam construction out farther. It's an American construction building technique. It's a product of the Industrial Revolution or early 20th century because it allowed for mass production and assembly of materials, particularly with the baby boom generation, people returning from World War II, and a housing boom. They needed to be able to build a lot of homes really quickly. And originally, balloon framing was an insulting term due to the fact that people did not think it would actually work. So if you've ever been past a building site, or maybe if you ever worked on Habitat for Humanity, something like this might look familiar to you. So balloon framing has now been used on millions of smaller buildings, not only homes. Sightings for balloon framed homes include things like clapboard, asbestos shingles, cedar shingles, tile, and slate. The materials vary in cost. They all have their own aesthetic possibilities and practical advantages. So for example, aluminum is lightweight, durable, and maintenance-free. However, aluminum siding is shaped like clapboard and sometimes given a fake grain or a bogus grain, and so that kind of looks cheap sometimes to people's eyes. So this is an example of wood being used successfully in a home, I would say, and balloon framing being successful in a home. And it's called the stick style because it's kind of allowing the trusses and the framework of the house to be seen on the outside. This was designed by Richard Morris Hunt. This is called the J&A Griswold House for the family who lived there in Newport, Rhode Island. And we'll also see Cape Cod style homes in Levittown, Long Island, which was a suburb of New York City, which I'll talk about that in a second. But this kind of shows you the imaginativeness that you can get with wood. Allows for beautiful open interiors and kind of allowing an interplay between horizontals, verticals, diagonals. It's kind of a delight. Looks like a delightful place to live. Looks like something you might find in the Shire. And then these homes here are from Levittown, and actually there's Levittowns all over the country. There were 17,000 of these built following the baby boom after World War II. And basically they were homes built on 60 by 100 foot plots carved out of potato fields. The homes had an eat-in kitchen, 2 tiny bedrooms, a bath on the first floor, and an expansion attic if you wanted to create a room into that. And well, this is the beginning of the suburbs, essentially what you're seeing here, where you could have row after row after row of identical home. So bulldozers would have smoothed already flat terrain and pour concrete slabs for the foundation. Then they would erect the balloon frames on top of those, side them, roof them, trees planted, grass sown, kaboom, you've got a neighborhood. Okay, the next thing we're going to look at is cast iron architecture, which is also a product of the 19th century's Industrial Revolution, and it also changed the realm of architecture, and we'll see why in a moment. It was a welcome alternative to stone and wood. It also allowed for the erection of taller buildings with thinner walls. It has great strength, but it's very heavy. What it allowed for is something called prefabrication, where you could assemble the materials off-site at a factory and then bring them already made to the site and assemble them, and also something leading into steel cage construction, which allowed for the creation of skyscrapers. So let's have a look. So this is an early example of a prefabricated building, which unfortunately no longer exists, but this was a hugely popular place in the 19th century. This was part of a great exhibition that was held in Hyde Park in London, and it covered 17 acres, and it was prefabricated. So as I said, the iron parts were cast at the factory, not at the site, and the new railroads facilitated their transportation, and then it was a simple matter to bolt everything together at the exhibition. And what was popular about this were, the massive glass walls where you have the steel is holding, or the iron parts are holding everything up and holding everything together. And basically it was an iron skeleton with all of these arches and trusses and so forth. And the skeleton provided, the framework for the glass to be laid on it. And then the Eiffel Tower is another example of cast iron architecture. This was built in Paris in 1889 for another industrial exhibition, and it was created to kind of show the possibilities of cast iron architecture. But Gustave Eiffel, who created the Eiffel Tower, was made fun of by critics because they were kind of like, but it's an open structure. It doesn't have a facade. It's a building without an interior. But of course, today, it's a huge symbol for the city of Paris, and everybody loves it and loves to go up in it. The pieces of the 1,000-foot tower were prefabricated, and they assembled the tower on site within 17 months by 150 workers. So structures like these were the inspiration for steel cage construction, which we shall see next. So steel cage architecture uses very strong metal, steel, with some carbon and other materials. It's harder than cast iron and it's very expensive. However, because of its strength, you can use less of it. And skeletal forms of steel result in literal steel cages, which you'll see, and then facades and inner walls are hung from the skeleton. And this is what led to kind of the skyscraper boom of the United States. So steel, it's a strong metal of iron alloyed with small amounts of carbon and a variety of other metals. And steel cages are skeletal forms onto which I-beams can be riveted or welded. And as for pilasters and cornice, I'm going to just show you rather than try to give you a textbook definition. So here we have steel cage construction. This is like literally the skeleton of just about every office building you'll ever see in a city. If you've ever walked down the street in Philadelphia, if you've looked at Liberty Place or anything like that, you've probably seen something that used this as its basis. So what you're looking at here is the Wainwright building created by Louis Sullivan in 1890, and this is the Wainwright building, and this is the very first skyscraper, which to our eyes today looks pretty small, but at the time, let me tell you, it was a very big deal. And in those days, architecture, I believe, was a lot more beautiful. And so what a pilaster is, he made use of a pilaster and of cornices along the side. So a pilaster is basically an engaged column, which means a column that is attached to the building. So if you think of, here's the column, and it's kind of got a bottom and a top running up in between, and then each window has a very pretty kind of decorative element on the outside. And then up here, this is called a frieze, which also is decorated. And then up here is the cornice, like the corner of the building. So it crowns the structure quite, literally. So Sullivan had a motto, form follows function. And so for him, the function of the building was just as important as the form. The form, the beauty of it, the aesthetics of it needed to be integrated with the beauty of it. So this is an early skyscraper, as I said. It's the lead-in to what was to follow in the later 20th century. So I'm using here, this is Liberty Place, which I mentioned before, with some more traditional type buildings around it. Again, they all use that steel cage. And when you see this glass along the side of buildings like this, that's called a curtain wall. And, it sort of mirrors back everything around it. So this is New York City's Lever House, right here, which was designed by Gordon Bunshaft of Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. And it is pretty much a textbook landmark example of steel cage construction using a curtain wall. And although the skyscraper is only 24 stories high, it's got that very minimalist rectangular profile that we see, typical of hundreds of buildings by the 1960s. And the other thing it did is they integrated the office building with a public area. Down here on the first floor, you've got an open plaza, and on the roof, actually it's the first couple of stories, there's like a garden and there's walkways, so people can cut through here and cut across part of the city block on which the building sits. So, and then evening light will angle down into the plaza and illuminate the avenue beneath. So then we have a quote from Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, less is more, and this becomes a thing in the 20th century, where less is more, basically a wall with windows on it. So, reinforced concrete architecture is next. Reinforced concrete was originally invented by a gardener in the 1860s. He used it to strengthen his garden pots. Basically, you have steel mesh or steel rods inserted into wet concrete, and you can create great shapes with this. And you basically insert the steel or the mesh into the concrete, shape it how you want to shape it, and then you let it harden. So advantages are it's less susceptible to pulling apart at stress points, the concrete prevents the steel from rusting, it can span greater distances than stone, it supports more weight than steel, and it can take on more natural shapes. So this is Le Corbusier's Chapel of Notre Dame du Haut, and this is what's referred to as the brutalist style, which comes from the French brut, meaning rough, uncut or raw, and basically the steel web is spun for the structure, the concrete is cast in place, and they left the marks of the wooden form on its surface. If you go by Center Square, right around Suburban Station in Philly, you'll notice a lot of the buildings, they're concrete, but they have kind of a texture to them, similar sort of thing. The white walls, the dark roof, and the white towers are decorated only by the texture of these reinforced concrete slabs. And on the inside, the walls are very thick, as you can see from the outside. When we look inside, you've got these windows piercing the side that allow the light to come in and let it feel, somewhat mysterious. And then some of you might have seen this if you live in Western PA or you've ever gotten out that way. Frank Lloyd built this very famous house. It's known as Falling Water. It's also known as the Kaufman House for the original family that lived there. He actually built this for a family. And this gives us a very different application of reinforced concrete. We have cantilevered decks of reinforced concrete rushing outward into the landscape, basically integrating the waterfall surrounding the house into the house. So it's pretty amazing in that way. And for him, he was not an austere person. He often, in fact, all the time, every single one of his building projects would not only exceed the budget that had been originally allotted, that it also exceeded the amount of time that he told people it would take, So contractors, if you've ever had anything built, they do that all the time. So in any case, it was hugely expensive to build. It's also hugely expensive to maintain because, well, there's a waterfall running through the house, and if you've ever had the issue of water coming into your house, you know how expensive that can be. This is another amazing example of what an architect can do with concrete. This is Habitat Expo 67 in Montreal, and I think there's a few other places like this built by the same architect, Moshe Safdie, throughout the world, and it's basically apartment buildings. And his idea was to build buildings that would be economical and also allow for, say, the roof of one person's house to become the balcony of another's. So, it's efficient use of space in that way, and it looks really cool. So the next thing is steel cable architecture. And steel cable bridges are not new. The Asian culture has made suspension bridges for thousands of years. With steel cable, many parallel wires are intertwined so that they share the stress of the load. Advantages of it include that it is strong, it is flexible, it can sway during weather and traffic conditions. And this is the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, and this is an old picture, obviously, because the Twin Towers are in there. But you can see how the cables are holding up the bridge, and under, say, windy or even hurricane conditions, the steel cable allows for a natural amount of sway so that the bridge is not rigid, it won't crack. So we're actually looking at a tribute to Ground Zero, since we just saw the Twin Towers here, no, we're not, because our stupid thing didn't give us a bleh thing for it. But take my word for it, there was a really cool picture that you're not going to see. I'm so sorry. Shell architecture. So we looked at that a little bit from the idea of a geodesic dome. Shell architecture could also be considered to be like tent architecture. If you've taken my African art course, you might see that people in the desert are very adept at building the shells that their tents are going to go over. It doesn't look like anything that you or I might camp in. It's something that's meant to be a bit more durable. So similar sort of idea. So shells are capable of spanning greater spaces and can be constructed from reinforced concrete, wood, stone, paper, etc. And here again we have Buckminster Fuller's amazing dome in Montreal. So there are also new materials and new visions, new idea in architecture of you can think it, we can build it. Global architects now adopt high-tech metals and methods, and different visions concerning assembling designs and buildings have created new and interesting buildings, and architects are using more unorthodox building materials. So do I have pictures of these? No, I don't. All right, so I'm going to stop there. I think this has probably gone on enough, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in Chapter 12.